Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're trying something a bit different. We're stepping behind those very ornate doors. You know the ones. One of the world's oldest and, let's be honest, most mysterious institutions, the Vatican. And specifically, we're looking at the Conclave. Sacred, yes, but also intensely political. So if you've ever found yourself wondering what really goes on in those cloistered halls, how hidden agendas, maybe global forces shape decisions the public just never sees, well, you're in the right place. We're about to unravel a story that, just a few years back, really captivated millions. A story full of hope, huge anticipation, and then, well, a pretty surprising outcome. We are, of course, talking about Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. For many, he wasn't just a cardinal. He was nicknamed the Asian Francis, a figure whose presence just resonated, deeply spiritual but also profoundly human. That grace. People talked about his tear-stained sermons delivered with this raw emotion, his almost magnetic humility. It just drew people in. And his visionary spirit, it really captured imaginations. From Manila, his home, all the way to Madrid. His influence was, well, you could feel it. The world wasn't just watching him. Many were expecting him. Try and picture it. May 9th, 2025. All eyes glued to that chimney, Sistine Chapel. And the white smoke starts billowing, thick, promising. A new pope has been chosen. And there was this almost collective holding of breath, a real palpable expectation across the Catholic world that it had to be Tagle. He seemed to so many the undeniable future, a beacon for reform, for renewed engagement. But then, those famous balcony doors swing open, the name is announced. It wasn't him, just wasn't. So the big mystery we're digging into today isn't just who got chosen, but why Tagle, this really compelling figure, fell short. What actually happened behind those closed doors? What were the unseen forces shaping the outcome? And why did one of the most, truly compelling candidates in modern church history, someone who seemed perfectly positioned, why didn't he make it? Our mission today is to pull back that curtain, look at the hidden drama, dissect this intricate geopolitical crucible where faith meets strategy. We'll be your guides, digging into the sources you shared, pulling out the key insights to help you understand this really complex event. Okay, let's dive in.
It's a great starting point because the conclave, well, despite all the sacred rituals, the spiritual discernment, it really does operate like a geopolitical crucible, just as the sources say. It's so much more than just a religious gathering. It's genuinely a battlefield of influence, ideology, and crucially, silent negotiations. People on the outside might imagine it's purely about divine inspiration, this kind of ethereal process. But it's vital to grasp that it is absolutely not a public vote. Not even close. Think of it more like a strategic, cloistered chessboard. That's a good image. Influence there doesn't come from campaigns or public debates. It flows through these intricate silent networks, deep personal loyalties, and often subtle but very powerful ideological alignment. Every cardinal walking in there brings their faith, sure, their prayers, yes, but also decades of experience, their unique viewpoints, and their distinct political leanings, priorities of the church.
That cloistered chessboard analogy really clicks. It makes you realize just how different the inside game must be from any election we usually see. And when we place Cardinal Tagle onto that chessboard, the early signs, according to our sources, suggest he wasn't just a player. He was maybe the player to watch. They mentioned he was reportedly a clear frontrunner in those initial voting rounds. There was real momentum. You could almost feel it building, generating excitement, hope, even expectation among quite a few cardinals. It felt like that global energy around him was actually translating into something tangible inside the Sistine Chapel, maybe even unstoppable. He was the name on everyone's lips, the one who seemed, well, almost destined for it. But then, as the votes went on, something changed. Big time.
Exactly. That initial momentum, as strong as it seemed, it just stalled. Our sources indicate that while Tagle definitely inspired hearts, his charisma, his vision were undeniable, his very presence and the direction he represented also unsettled camps within the College of Cardinals. And it's so important to remember, this college is anything but uniform. It's complex, it's nuanced, it's made up of these distinct blocks. Each block has its own deeply held priorities, its own vision for the church, and significantly, its own fears about where things might be headed. We're not talking simple political parties, but deep-seated stances.
Right, these blocks. Can we unpack those a bit? Who are they, generally speaking?
Sure. So first you have the reformists. These are often cardinals who push for a church that's maybe more decentralized. They want local bishops to have more say, more lay involvement, that idea of synodality you hear about. They're keen on changes that bring more transparency, more accountability, and they often focus heavily on social justice, seeing the church's mission tied closely to the poor and marginalized.
Okay, so reformists pushing for change, and on the other side, You mentioned traditionalists.
Yes, the traditionalists. They tend to prioritize continuity, preserving core church structures, theological traditions. Their concerns often center on things like liturgical changes or theological shifts they see as maybe watering down doctrine. They value maintaining the church's hierarchy. Stability is key for them. Clear, unambiguous teaching. They often view rapid change as a threat to the church's identity, its spiritual core. They're wary of things that might weaken orthodoxy or blur lines.
So a real tension there between reform and tradition. What about the other groups?
Now, then you have the diplomats. These cardinals often come from backgrounds in the Vatican Secretariat of State, where they've served as nuncios, ambassadors around the world. Their main focus, usually the church's global standing, its relationships with governments, maintaining the Holy See's influence internationally. They tend to favor pragmatic solutions, keeping good relations. They see the papacy as a vital diplomatic player. Institutional effectiveness is big for them, especially in dealing with world powers.
Okay, the diplomats focusing on the world stage. And the last group.
And finally, the doctrinal purists, often academics, theologians. Their priority is theological orthodoxy, almost above all else. They're concerned with the integrity, the purity of Catholic doctrine and moral teaching. They see the church's main job as upholding revealed truth, and they're very sensitive to anything that looks like a compromise with secular ideas or modern culture. For them, theological precision, passing on the dogma faithfully, that's paramount.
Wow, it really paints a picture of a very intricate ecosystem of beliefs and priorities, almost like different species coexisting, sometimes uneasily. And into this environment steps Tagle. With his unique mix of qualities, he almost inevitably becomes, as you said, a lightning rod. His pastoral warmth, that emotional resonance that connected with so many, his close ties to Pope Francis, that definitely signaled continuity, right? A natural follow-on from Francis's focus on mercy, outreach.
Absolutely. But, as the sources show, for some, that very continuity was the issue. It was perhaps too much of it. His huge global appeal and progressive reputation, they made him incredibly attractive to the modern-minded cardinals. They saw him as the future, a revitalized church. But for others, especially those who feared a deeper unraveling of old structures, those traditions, he became a real point of contention, almost an existential threat for some.
And this is where the real strategy comes in. The calculated maneuvering of Vatican chess masters, as the sources put it.
Precisely. This is where it gets really intriguing. The sources talk about rival factions, and get this, sometimes even factions that were ideologically opposed to each other, reportedly forming these tactical alliances. And here's the kicker, the really crucial bit. These alliances weren't always about electing their favorite candidate. Not at all. The main goal, the unifying factor, was often negative, defensive. It was specifically to stop Tagle from reaching the required two-thirds majority.
Wow.
Yeah, it's classic political maneuvering, really. You see it everywhere. Opposition groups uniting not for something, but against something or someone. They might totally disagree on who should be pope, but they could agree very strongly on who shouldn't be. And that concerted effort, that strategic blocking, it tilted the scales decisively.
So just to make sure I'm getting this, even if various groups couldn't agree on candidate A, B, or C, they could agree that candidate Tagle was not the one they wanted. And that agreement was enough to stop him.
That's exactly the dynamic the sources suggest. It's a powerful force in any closed election system, but especially one like the Conclave. It just underscores how pragmatic, how political the dynamics really are, way beyond what most people see or understand. It's not just piety. It's power, it's influence, it's the future direction of a massive global institution.
Which brings us neatly to another key point the sources raise, this idea that many cardinals weren't just looking for a spiritual leader. They weren't necessarily seeking another prophet like Tagle, with his famous spiritual charisma and deeply pastoral heart. Instead, the word used is that they were looking for a governor. That implies something quite different, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That distinction, prophet versus governor, is critical. It tells you a lot about the anxieties, the priorities inside the college at that moment. A governor, in this context, as the sources describe it, is someone with a strong, steady hand. Someone who could steer the bark of Peter through stormy geopolitical waters and shifting cultural tides. It signals a clear preference for political skill, strong administrative ability, and effective diplomacy over purely pastoral gifts. It suggests there was this perceived urgent need for a leader who could manage the huge institutional machinery of the church and navigate its complex relationships with world powers, often in a world that's increasingly secular, even hostile.
What kind of challenges would fall under that governor role?
Well, think about it. The church is constantly dealing with massive institutional challenges, financial scandals needing cleanup, declining numbers in traditional strongholds, managing really complex interfaith relations, especially in conflict zones. And then there's the ongoing, often tricky, curial reforms started by Francis. These aren't just spiritual issues, they're huge administrative, diplomatic tasks. A governor is someone with proven experience in handling that kind of high-stakes stuff. Someone who understands international law, finance, strategic comms, the art of negotiation. It's almost like being CEO of a global entity, not just a spiritual guide.
And the prime example given is Cardinal Parolin.
It's exactly. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State. His resume just screams governor. We're talking decades of work in diplomacy and ecclesiastical negotiation. And crucially, he was the chief architect of back-channel talks with Beijing. Quote, think about how sensitive, how politically charged, how incredibly complex that is. Navigating that relationship requires immense skill. And those skills, the sources suggest, signaled papal readiness in a way that homilies and humanitarian gestures alone could not.
So while Tagle could inspire millions, Parolin represented that pragmatic, admin-savvy, politically astute leader that many cardinals seemed to feel the church needed right then. Someone comfortable in the corridors of power.
So it really came down to a judgment call on what kind of leadership was most needed at that specific moment. And, almost paradoxically, Tagle's perceived lack of deep-rooted curial clout and his relatively short tenure in Vatican leadership, that became a weakness. It did. The sources say this made some uneasy about entrusting him with the full weight of the papacy. It wasn't a knock on his spirituality or holiness. It was about his institutional track record, or perceived lack of it, within the very specific, very arcane structures of the Roman Curia.
What exactly is curial clout? It sounds important, but a bit vague.
Good question. Curial clout basically refers to the influence, the network, a cardinal builds up inside the Roman Curia, that huge administrative bureaucracy running the Holy See. It's about knowing the ropes, understanding the internal mechanisms, the unwritten rules. It's having relationships built over decades. And it's about having a proven track record of managing the church's global operations from Rome. Because the Pope isn't just a spiritual figurehead, he's the Bishop of Rome, head of this massive administration. So being deeply familiar with its workings, its people, its history, its processes, that's often seen as essential for governing effectively.
And Tagle hadn't spent as much time inside that system.
Right. He had immense pastoral gifts, theological depth, sure. But much of his career was in the Philippines. He only moved to Rome relatively recently for his job at the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. A big job, yes, but it didn't give him that same deep, prolonged immersion in the Curia's day-to-day life as cardinals who'd spent decades there. So this points to a clear prioritization of internal Vatican political experience and network. It became a key, maybe unspoken factor. The feeling might have been that the church, at that moment, needed a seasoned administrator, a governor, more than a charismatic outsider, no matter how inspiring. A pragmatic calculation.
Which leads us straight into what the sources call the harsh reality of image politics. Tagle was, no question, one of the most beloved figures in the global church. His popularity, that grassroots support, was immense, almost unprecedented for a cardinal from Asia. Yet this external image, this huge public adoration, was ultimately insufficient inside the conclave. It's a really stark reminder that the conclave is not a public vote.
It's a fundamental disconnect, isn't it? We, outside, see the public face, the appeal, the millions who admired him. But inside those walls, it's that cloistered chessboard where influence flows through silent networks, personal loyalties, and ideological alignment. That cloistered nature changes everything. Public opinion, media buzz, doesn't carry much weight. Instead, it's about internal relationships, favors owed, quiet endorsements from key figures, building consensus through discreet chats.
So his luminous image outside the Vatican didn't necessarily translate into political capital inside it. That's such a strange, almost cruel paradox. The very thing that made him so compelling to the world might have actually hurt him internally. How could that happen?
It's really intriguing and, yeah, very human. Some insiders, according to the sources, apparently whispered that his superstar status may have worked against him, which immediately hints at some level of internal political jealousies and rivalries. Human nature. Even in a sacred election. Just imagine for a second, you're a cardinal. You spent decades working quietly, diligently, maybe unseen inside the Curia, slowly rising through the ranks. And then you see someone with this massive public profile, this charisma, almost a media favorite, gaining huge external prominence, maybe leapfrogging years of that behind-the-scenes work.
I can see how that might cause some friction.
Exactly. That kind of supercell status, it could easily raise suspicions, stir envy, and overshadow more institutionally embedded candidates. Some might wonder, Is his popularity genuine substance or just public appeal? Others might feel overlooked, resentful even. It's subtle but powerful. The spotlight that made Tagle shine globally might have cast some unwelcome shadows inside the conclave, breeding a quiet resistance among those who value long institutional service over external charisma.
So, despite all the talk of divine guidance, the prayers, the spiritual discernment, which are surely part of it, the sources really seem to argue that ultimately it wasn't Tagle's smile or sainthood aura that decided his fate. Huh. In the end, they say, it boiled down to the cold calculus of ecclesiastical politics. That feels quite blunt, suggesting a very pragmatic, maybe even brutal political process at heart. It feels like where the emotional hopes of millions outside crash against the hard reality inside.
Yeah, cold calculus is a strong phrase. It refers to that dispassionate assessment. Looking at a candidate's administrative skills, their ability to manage the curia, their diplomatic touch, how they align with different power blocks. It's about judging their potential to either keep things stable or bring about change without breaking the institution. It's weighing the practicalities. Strategically thinking about what the church needs to survive and thrive long term. Looking beyond the inspiring public image to assess perceived weaknesses and strengths for governing.
Okay, and connecting this to the bigger picture. Another huge factor seems to have been his age, the resistance to a potentially long and transformative papacy. At 67, he was relatively young for a potential pope. He represented the chance of papacy that could stretch 2 decades or more. That's a seriously long time.
An incredibly long time.
Yeah.
Especially for an institution like the Catholic Church. Ancient, tradition-bound, cautious, and that potential length, especially from a pope known for his progressive outlook and deep emotional resonance with young Catholics, well, that was clearly too long a horizon for some cardinals to commit to, he was seen as a bit of a wild card. A younger pope, especially one like Tagle with that forward-thinking vision, could really bring sweeping changes, could challenge entrenched systems, could potentially outlast multiple curial power shifts. And that inherent unpredictability, that potential for a really long fundamental reshaping of the church, it was just not tolerated easily by Vatican traditionalists. It's understandable if you value stability and slow, predictable evolution above all else.
What was the specific fear there? Just the length or something more?
Well, the sources make it clear it wasn't just the duration. It was fundamentally about the legacy a younger, reform-minded pope could build. A younger pope has the time and the freedom to reshape the Roman Curia. Think about all the key appointments they make over, say, 20 years. Heads of departments, tribunals, congregations. That implies a huge political shift in power and influence, potentially moving it away from established structures, established figures who've held power for ages. A long papacy like that could also lead to major ideological shifts, appointing bishops who align with his vision, potentially changing the church's direction for generations.
Can you give an example of the alternative?
Sure. Look at Pope Benedict XVI election in 2005. He was 78. Widely seen and largely acted as a clearly transitional figure. His papacy was viewed as offering a short, stabilizing pontificate, which was comforting to those wary of big changes after John Paul II's long reign. It was like a period of consolidation, a pause. Tagle, though, he represented something much more profound, a lasting reordering, a real generational shift, and many just weren't ready for that. The fear wasn't just of the man, but of the scale and length of the change he symbolized.
It sounds like the cardinals were weighing this potential for sustained, maybe radical change against a very deep desire for continuity, for stability, a predictable path. Tagle felt like a huge, maybe tectonic shift. And for many inside, that was just too much, too soon.
Exactly. His energy, his vision, his global popularity assets on the world stage, yes, but potentially seen as destabilizing forces within the careful, slow-moving conclave ecosystem. It looks like a choice for caution over transformation.
So beyond the politics and the age factor, the sources dig even deeper into Tagle's actual vision and also the subtle impact of his cultural background. He had this really transformative vision for Catholicism, didn't he? Advocating for a church that listens more than it lectures, embraces rather than excludes, and walks hand in hand with a wounded world. That sounds powerful.
It was, and it wasn't just talk. His ideas for reform were pretty specific, and for some, quite radical. He openly pushed for greater roles for women in ministry, not just token gestures, but a real structural shift in how the church is run. He was a big advocate for interfaith collaboration, especially with Muslims and Buddhists. That came straight from his experience in Southeast Asia, where that dialogue is just part of daily life. He spoke with this prophetic urgency about climate justice, echoing concerns of the poor, those hit hardest by environmental problems. These were convictions, as the sources say, forged in missionary and pastoral work. Real-world stuff. His dream, was church less obsessed with authority, more devoted to compassion, less focused on dogma, more anchored in dialogue.
And while so many people globally saw him as the heir to Pope Francis's reformist spirit, that very connection, that similarity, actually unsettled others.
Precisely. To the conservative bloc, Tagle's boldness wasn't refreshing. It felt profoundly destabilizing.
Hmm.
They had this deep fear his vision would accelerate a shift they weren't ready to endorse, that the actual fabric of ecclesial tradition might unravel too quickly if he was in charge. His forward-looking ideals, compelling as they were to many, were seen as too ahead of his time for a conclave that often needs compromise, needs consensus, especially on the pace of change. It hints at a real fear of losing control, losing identity.
And this ties into geography, too, this idea of Vatican's geographic inertia.
It does. For centuries, the Vatican's focus, institutionally, has rarely strayed far from Europe, and even more rarely from Italy. It's just historical fact. This has often made the conclave feel, as the sources say, like an exclusive European fraternity. Consider the Philippines, a dynamic stronghold of Catholicism, over 80 million faithful, huge, vibrant. Yet many inside the college still seem to view Asia as a spiritual giant, but a political newcomer, like an emerging market for the faith maybe, but not quite ripe for full leadership of the universal church.
That's a stark contrast, isn't it? The energy and numbers in Asia versus this ingrained European-centric view in Rome.
It is. And it led to this preference for institutional comfort. Cardinals instinctively gravitating back to familiar continents, Europe, Latin America, where church governance feels deeply entrenched, where change is usually slow, predictable. So Tagle's candidacy representing this intercultural, emotionally intelligent, pastoral, and post-colonial future, a truly global perspective from outside the West, it got overlooked. Overlooked in favor of a more predictable, manageable, and geographically safe past.
Which brings us to this idea of a cultural clash.
Yes, a profound, maybe subtle, cultural clash. Tagle, coming from a Southeast Asian background, his Filipino heritage, his very pastoral, emotional style, he really did embody a global church in a unique way. He represented something profoundly different. Different leadership style, different communication, different priorities. The Vatican, meanwhile, is still deeply rooted in Roman custom, Italian sensibilities, and a preference for familiar modes of governance. Think legalism, ancient rites, centralized authority, those subtle power networks.
So his ability to bridge worlds, which seems like a gift,
Might have become a silent disqualifier for some. For certain conservative cardinals, the idea of a pope from the Philippines, with his specific cultural lens, his pastoral focus, it just might have felt too foreign, too fast, too far from Rome's gravitational center, maybe even too far from the tradition they were sworn to protect. That wasn't necessarily a conscious rejection of him, but the sources suggest it created this subtle resistance, this quiet unease, an unease with what his election would mean for the papacy's future direction, its cultural identity, almost an unspoken bias maybe, a discomfort with stepping too far outside the familiar Roman identity of the papacy. And that quiet discomfort might have been the most powerful invisible barrier he faced.
this deep dive has really peeled back the layers, hasn't it? The power, tradition, the human dynamics inside the conclave. So Cardinal Tagle's mischance, it wasn't just one thing. As we've explored, it seems it was the result of a perfect storm, a convergence of forces.
That sums it up well. It was complex. You had tradition clashing with transformation head-on. His bold vision for a more inclusive church collided with entrenched Vatican conservatism, that preference for slow, careful change. Then add in the strategic power plays, those alliances designed specifically to stop him, and that underlying cultural hesitancy toward truly global leadership. All these threads tangled together.
In many ways, Tagle seemed to represent the future. Courageous, compassionate, truly global, embodying that growing Catholicism outside Europe. But in 2025, when the white smoke appeared, the cardinals ultimately chose familiarity over forward motion. It feels like they weren't rejecting Tagle the person, the beloved leader. They were perhaps resisting what his papacy would have meant for the church's deep traditions, its power structures, its sense of self.
Yet, despite that outcome, Cardinal Tagle clearly remains a symbol of hope for millions worldwide. He's still out there, walking the path of service, shaping hearts with his message. It reminds us, influence goes way beyond official titles. And as the sources hint, maybe his story isn't over. For someone like him, history may yet call his name in ways we can't predict.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, something building on all this. What does this look inside the conclave tell us about that inherent tension, that often uncomfortable push and pull between tradition and progress within any long-established institution? Think about how these unseen forces, the politics, the culture, the internal rivalries, the quiet biases shape leadership decisions everywhere, way beyond what we see publicly. Whether it's the Vatican, a huge company, even governments, that constant dance between preserving the past and embracing the future. How does it continue to shape our world, often in ways we don't even realize? Something to think about.